This is the single most important thing that I learned early on in my career that helped me understand human movement at a deeper level and what happens as we start to see compensations and pain and issues pop up, and what we can do to pick the right exercises to help people feel better. You see, as we move into varying levels of hip bend, different joint actions are going to be present at the pelvis and the leg and the lower leg and the foot. And these things are usually coupled together, and it's going to give you an idea for why we see so many different types of movement compensations within the gym and also within people's movement as a whole. What you're going to see is a clip taken from the first week's content of my biomechanics course. And if you're interested in learning more and seeing these principles and concepts expanded upon with specific exercises, there's an early bird bundle sale happening right now where you can get this course in addition to a lot other complimentary courses and also products that is available only for the next week, and it is honestly an insane offer. So you can learn more about that down below.
Okay, relative motion versus orientation, or I say in this slide absolute orientation, because I want you to think of it as like a one thing, like the absolute orientation. Now, the name of the game is the balance between relative and orientation driven movement. Relative movement means that segments of a certain area are going to be moving relative to one another. Now, nutation is this concept that occurs within the sacrum, and the pelvic bones are going to move relative to that. So when my sacrum bone right here tips forward, I'm going to have a relative posterior tilting of the innominate bones right here. I'm going to make myself big so you can see it in a second. So this is nutation forward, and these bones rotate in and back. This would be, you can think of it like flexion of the sacrum and extension of the innominate bones. Inversely, you have extension of the sacrum, or you can think of it as counter nutation. And when that happens, these bones move into external rotation, abduction, and flexion. That is relative movement. One more time. Nutation, sacrum moves forward, these bones rotate in. Now, do you see that relative to the position of the sacrum moving forward, these bones rotate in and back? You see that? That's a relative movement. If I move into counter nutation, so as this sacrum tips back, these bones rotate out relative to that. Now, I know this one's kind of weird because it's very clear to see like nutation, these bones rotate back, but in counter nutation, they're actually moving forward relative to the sacrum. And that is a relative movement. Another example of that could be at the shoulder. As I move into more overhead flexion, my humerus is going to move relative to my scapula. So I'm going to move into more upward rotation and external rotation of my scap. That would be relative movement. Orientation is what happens when we usually lack relative movement, or we need to do things in a very fast or high output fashion. So if I didn't have time, or I needed to produce a lot of force quickly, or I simply lacked relative movement at my pelvis in terms of nutation and this bone coming forward, instead, I could simply just dump my whole pelvis forward. And that would create anterior pelvic tilt, as many people think about it, but that would be an orientation-driven movement. On the other hand, if we're thinking about the shoulder example, if I didn't have the ability to get my scapula to upwardly rotate on my rib cage and my humerus to externally rotate, then what I could just do instead is I can just bend my whole back and just orient my thorax so that way I can get further overhead. That would be orientation. And counter nutation of the pelvis, if I lack the ability to get this, then I would just dump my whole pelvis under me. This is what we call the limb arc model or the hip flexion movement arc. Depending on how much hip flexion you're in, you're going to be biased towards certain joint actions. From about 0 to 60 degrees of hip flexion, let's just use a squat because it's so easy to look at it through that lens and understand what's happening. 0 to 60 degrees is a position of external rotation and counter nutation. You're going to be in a relatively more plantar flexed position than you would be if you went lower in this squat. Now, just in a normal standing position, if I'm just standing upright against gravity, that is more of an internally rotated position. That is a closed pack position of my pelvis. That is a nutated position of my pelvis. And once I start to unlock my knees and I move into a squat from 0 to about 60 degrees, we externally rotate. And we move into counter nutation. Our pelvic floor is going to drop a little bit. So therefore, if you put someone in less than 60 degrees of hip flexion, you can bias them towards external rotation in many cases. Once we move down to about 60 to 100 degrees of hip flexion or hip bend, this is internal rotation, which is maximized around 90 degrees of hip flexion. This is actually where you need the most amount of dorsiflexion and pronation of your foot. This is where internal rotation is at its highest. But when we're thinking about a squat, this is predominantly external rotation in nature, as you can see on the slide. But we move into a relative amount of internal rotation from 60 to 100 degrees. Remember, I said the word relative. This is why we need relative motions. We're starting to access them here. So from 60 to about 100 degrees, we move into more of a position of nutation, internal rotation, from a position of external rotation and also counter nutation. So one more time, we're just standing upright. We're in more of an internally rotated position. As we unlock our knees up to 60 degrees, we move into external rotation. Then we start to move into nutation and internal rotation. Think about it like this. If I'm going to flex my elbow, right, I'm going to do a bicep curl. This is a flexed position, more of an externally rotated position. But I can move relatively into more of an extended position and a lengthened position of my bicep. So the same thing is happening here. The squat is pretty external rotation focused. Hip flexion is pretty external rotation focused. But as I move into that midpoint, I move relatively into more of an internally rotated position. And then at the bottom, we move back into an externally rotated position. That doesn't mean we're fully internally rotated, just like I'm not fully extended within my elbow. I'm moving just into some. So when we move into extension, internal rotation, adduction, this is also dorsiflexion and pronation. The knees are going to be going over the toes. We're going to need to have our foot arch flatten out a little bit. So as we internally rotate our femur, our tibia should also internally rotate, and our foot arch goes down. And we move into that dorsiflexion and pronation position. Now at the bottom, when we're in 100 to about 120 degrees of hip flexion, we then move back into a position of external rotation and counter nutation. So we were externally rotated, moved into a position of more internal rotation, but not fully internally rotated. Now we're moving back to a position of external rotation. This is actually relative plantar flexion and supination of the foot. Many people think the deeper you get into a squat, the more ankle mobility you need. You actually don't need more beyond about 100 degrees. You actually move, if you see someone go into a nice, really good relative motion biased squat, their knees actually have a tendency to slightly move back at the very bottom position of a squat because you're moving into a relatively plantar flexed and supinated position than you were before. So at this point, the sacrum is going to move back into counternutation, and those innominate bones are going to move back into, so let's say you're internally rotated here. You're then going to move back into, it's kind of hard for me to show you this, external rotation in the deepest range right here and counternutation. So one more time, you move from this 60 to 100 degree zone of internal rotation back to external rotation, and then this moves back into counternutation. One more time from the top. Standing position, you're in more of an internally rotated position because that's hip extension. Hip extension is IR. Now, as we move into about 0 to 60 degrees, pelvic floor drops. That's counternutation, ER. From 60 to 100 degrees, we move into IR from a position of ER. And then at the very bottom, we move into ER from a position of IR. Let's break this down. I'm going to give you some real life examples, and this should really start to click. Why is it that someone's knees would collapse in a squat when they're moving up into that concentric phase of the lift? Let's say they're at the bottom, they're at 100 degrees of hip flexion, they start to come up and their knees collapse in. Why would that happen? Well, maybe they lack the relative motions with that amount of load that they're using, and their knees are moving in because they lack genuine internal rotation. So they're finding an orientation of internal rotation to produce that force. Why would someone's back overextend in a deadlift? Why would someone do this? Which we see all the time. Maybe they lack the genuine nutation and internal rotation to produce that force and fully stand up. Maybe they're going to push their back further forward so that way they can access more internal rotation and then start to come up from there in an extended state. Why would someone move into a butt wink in a squat? Why would someone have that rounded back as they move into this is a good squat from Trevor, but imagine someone moves into a squat and their butt tucks underneath them. Well, that's that 100 to 120 degrees of hip flexion range. Maybe they lack the relative motion to move from a position of internal rotation in that mid-range back to external rotation and counternutation. So what they do is they stay at the same amount of hip flexion and they just do this. Now, do you see how they moved into more hip flexion, except they just oriented? Nothing changed other than their low back flexing, rounding. This concept also applies to the upper body, which we'll talk about in week 3. Is this starting to make a little bit more sense? Why is it that when you elevate someone's heels in a squat, they can squat deeper? Well, there's a center of gravity thing involved with that. But also, if you were to elevate them on a wedge like this, then you would be biased towards a position of external rotation and plantar flexion. That would allow them to move into that relatively pronated position in that mid-range, and then they'd be able to better access external rotation at the bottom again. Yes, please, thanks. That's a more externally rotated position. Why is it that when you elevate someone's toes in a deadlift, they can deadlift better, with better form? Not necessarily something I'd use with a lot of weight, but if you elevate someone's toes, why does that make it easier? Well, you flatten out their foot arch, bias their tibia towards internal rotation, and now they can hinge better. That would make it much easier for them to push into a hinge if they have that toe elevation.